Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education here at the National First Ladies Library at the National First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. This has been a sold out lecture for us. That means we have at least 100 people who have signed up to be on the webinar today and on Facebook Live. So hopefully we're streaming on Facebook Live. Things look good when I set it up this morning. Before we get started, I want to tell you about some of our upcoming programs. If you haven't been with us before, welcome. The National First Ladies Library is in Canton, Ohio, and the historic site is currently open to the public. Our Education Center has 3 amazing exhibitions. One is about First Ladies on the campaign trail, super pertinent to right now, Ohio and suffrage, and also women who have run for president, breaking the glass ceiling. So we're really excited about that. And of course, currently our historic home is closed to the public, but the Victorian home has a lot of resonance with our discussion today, as it is contemporary to Ida McKinley's time period. So we're really excited to have Chris here this morning to speak. If you are joining us on Monday, we have a really amazing legacy lecture a day early because of the presidential election on November 2nd at 10 a.m. You can join us for a talk called We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the ERA at 10 a.m. with Dr. Sook. We're really excited about that. I think it should be really interesting. We also have a children's program called Ladies in the Lab, where you can sign up for a STEM kit that we will send to you with really cool activities, all inspired by a woman scientist. Tomorrow we have a film discussion. So we're working with Stark Library, where you can stream a film related to pertinent women's issues through their collection. This one this month is called This Changes Everything. It's about women in film. And we're going to be talking to Britt Sherrick of the Bechtel Film Fest. That's tomorrow at 10 a.m. So same time, same place on Zoom. Feel free to join us. And then in November, we're actually doing another film called Serve Like a Girl about women veterans, which we're really excited about. In November, we also are extending our First Ladies in Election discussion with a talk on female representation and political pins with the Bowling Green State University Pop Culture Library. So we're really excited about that. I think it should be really fun. And it's not too late to pick up our November book club book. We're reading The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd about Sarah Grimke. And it is so good. I'm really enjoying it right now. And then it's not too early to start thinking about the holidays. In December, we're going to have a great talk with a curator. That is actually posted on our social media page on Facebook. And it's going to be about the Reagan's Christmas card. So I think that should be really fun. I hope you will join us for those events. Or come here in person and tour the Education Center. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today, Chris Woodyard. We're super excited to be debuting Chris on Zoom. This is her very first Zoom talk, and I think she's going to do a great job. So Chris Woodyard is an Ohio writer and historian. She started her work on Victorian mourning quite early in her career, wandering around local graveyards as a child and doing a presentation on American funeral directing in 6th grade. She received her BA degree with honors in medieval and Renaissance studies from The Ohio State University, where her emphasis was on art history. She is the author of 9 books on Ohio ghostlore, the Haunted Ohio series, as well as 3 volumes of historical ghost stories, and the Victorian Book of the Dead, a book on the popular and material culture of Victorian mourning and death. She blogs at the Victorian Book of the Dead, and as Mrs Daffodil, writing on dress history and the ephemera of fashion. So I want to welcome Chris. She's going to unmute herself, and I just want to encourage, as she's doing that, because again, first timer on Zoom here, we encourage you to use the chat. She's given me a lot of cool notes and information that I'll be posting in the chat as she's speaking today. And as well, I encourage you to share any questions that you might have with Chris as we're doing this. So I'm going to mute myself and turn things over to Chris. Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Allison. I hope that the sound quality is good here. I'm speaking today on Behind the Veil, the Dark World of Victorian Mourning. In the midst of life, we are in death. This was no idle sentiment to the people of the 19th century who were exposed to the reality of death much more than any of us will ever be. Death came in all manner of ways: cholera, childbirth, an exploding kerosene lamp. From this contact with death, mourning rituals arose, elaborate and sometimes burdensome, but comfortingly familiar. This talk will unveil the history behind some of these dark Victorian customs. I'll be discussing the golden age of Crape from just after the Civil War up to the First World War. For Victorian mourning seems to be more of a cultural attitude than a strict time period. Death was always close at hand during the Victorian era. A bride knew that each childbed might bring the angel of death. Children died of measles, diphtheria, and whooping cough. An aged gentleman knew that a winter pneumonia might carry him off. But what happened after a death? In some households, clocks might be stopped and mirrors covered, but one of the most common actions after a death was to hang crape on the door. This could be a piece of the expensive crinkled black mourning fabric, or simply a ribbon or strip of cloth. White crape was hung for children, black for adults. Some crepes went on the doorknob, some on a bar or bracket, as you see in the slide, so it could be taken in at night. Shockingly, there was a ready market in stolen crape. Crape on the door signaled to the world that there'd been a death in the house, and it seemed to shock and horrify those who saw it in a way that we today would find difficult to comprehend. Next, the household would need to find mourning clothing. Etiquette dictated that the bereaved should not appear in public until they were dressed in mourning. The dressmaker would be summoned along with the undertaker. Speed was of the essence. One dressmaker revealed that she just basted everything together, and that after the funeral, she would return and sew things properly. If you lived in a big city, there were mourning warehouses that would send dressmakers and ready-made clothing to your home. They also sent out catalogs. One New York department store had on staff a professional widow who would come to the house with clothing and samples of mourning goods. The bereaved might also buy secondhand clothes, borrow clothing from a neighbor, or dye the family's ordinary clothes to the appropriate dark hue. We have stories of women who had just gotten new dresses, grumbling over having to dye them after a family death. After the Civil War, a death often meant a call for the undertaker. The establishments we know as funeral homes did not come into common use until the late 1800s, so bodies were frequently prepared and viewed at home. The undertaker might prepare the body using an arsenic-based fluid and the new arterial embalming method that had been developed to embalm soldiers during the Civil War so their bodies could be returned home. Or he might ice the corpse. Quite a few undertakers felt that better results were obtained with ice. Now, I had always imagined a tray of ice beneath the corpse, keeping it chilled rather like fish in the grocery case. But several 19th century undertakers said, frankly, that it was unlikely that they had ever buried anyone alive, because if the persons had been alive, they would have frozen to death when packed in ice. The object in icing a corpse was actually to freeze the body solid and let it gradually thaw. This is reflected in the hundreds of patents for corpse coolers in the patent archives. Here's one of them. Something that is never mentioned in the historic record is the sound of thawed ice water draining out the window. Next, if the family had not prepared one, the undertaker might provide a shroud for the body. In the 19th century hierarchy of mourning, a shroud was an essential element of a decent burial, second only to the coffin. A shroud meant several things in the 19th century. It could mean the old-fashioned winding sheet, the cloth wrapped around the body, in earlier days tied at head and foot, as was seen in the John Donne monument for which he posed in his shroud. Shroud could also refer to a special garment rather like a nightgown, often hand-sewn by the eventual user and stowed under the bed or in a special death drawer until needed. The shroud might also be sewn the night before the funeral by friends. Here we see this nightgown type of shroud used for women from the 18th through the mid-19th century. These were almost always worn with a cap, which reinforced the notion of the dead being just sleeping. The word shroud could also mean a burial suit, or as they were sometimes called, a casket robe, modeled on fashionable clothing and finished on the front but backless for ease in dressing the corpse. These were designed to look like regular clothing, a shirt and suit coat, or an elegant gown. The dead even wore shoes. One of the largest manufacturers of burial shoes in the country was the Practical Burial Footwear Company of Columbus, Ohio. They were practical because they had elastic or laces at the heel that allowed the shoe to fit on an otherwise rigid foot. Here are two burial robes from a Casket company's catalog, designed to look like regular fashionable dresses. And on the right, you see a patent sketch of a man's burial robe, designed to look like a shirt and coat. Although post-mortem photographs show many people apparently laid out in their own clothing, written documentation suggests that shrouds were the more popular choice. It seemed a waste to bury wearable clothing. The dead were only rarely buried in their own clothes, and even less often in someone else's clothing. There was a belief in some communities that it was unlucky to inter the dead in the clothes of the living. As they decayed, so would their owner, in a kind of sympathetic decomposition. There's a strange element of sexuality in later 19th century articles about burial fashions. Women's burial robes with their embellishments of lace and embroidery are lovingly described in the same language used by fashion writers for wedding gowns or for tea gowns. It was as if the dead were dressing to seduce death himself. One journalist wrote, "The finest and loveliest of materials, from softest cashmere to richest silk, filmy laces, jaunty ribbons, chiffon, and mousseline de soie, enter into the composition of the up-to-date shroud." Once clothed and coffined, the body would usually be laid out in the best parlor of the house. Until burial, the dead would not be left alone. Relatives, friends, and neighbors took turns sitting by the corpse. It was a sign of respect to the dead, who in common humanity were not to be left alone, just as the sick and dying were never abandoned. While the vigils, particularly there were only one or two watchers, could be very frightening, there is no truth to the modern suggestion that wakes were, one, to make sure the person was actually dead, or two, to prevent the corpse from becoming a vampire. That said, there are certainly stories of persons who did wake at their own wakes, startling the vigil keepers, and in several cases, literally scaring watchers to death. The Irish were famous for their rowdy wakes, where traditionally much alcohol was consumed, and there was a good deal of wailing and keening. Sometimes cards were played at a wake, songs might be sung, or people simply paid their respects and reminisced about the deceased. Now, serving alcohol to the watchers may have been a grave mistake. It was common for an undertaker to leave a container of embalming fluid at the house for the mourners to sprinkle on the corpse as a disinfectant. There was an amazing amount of carelessness over this fluid. It was left in tumblers and teacups and drunk by the unwary who mistook it for whiskey. One undertaker put embalming fluid into a champagne bottle and left it at the house of mourning. You can imagine the carnage. Here's an image of a lavish English Victorian funeral. The men in front carrying what look like covered brooms are bearers or mutes, and they served as professional mourners. The men with the trays of feathers were known as feathermen. The mutes and feathermen are relics of aristocratic funerals where draped staves of office and plumed helmets were carried in procession. These grim-looking mutes would first stand guard outside the house of mourning, then lead the funeral procession. Mutes might have trimmings of black or white, the white for the young and unmarried, and the black for adults. It may seem odd to see little girls carrying a coffin, but it was traditional for young people to serve as pallbearers for children's funerals, and there are touching anecdotes of dying children asking their friends to accompany their coffin to the graveyard. After the funeral, which could be held at church or at home, or later in the 19th and early 20th centuries at a funeral parlor, the coffin lid might be removed so mourners could kiss the dead or take one last look. In some communities, there was a belief that if you touched or kissed the corpse, the dead person could not come back and haunt you. The coffin lid was then screwed down and the coffin loaded into a hearse, which might be elaborately carved and have draped urns or ostrich plumes on the roof. The hearse was often drawn by black horses, although a white hearse and horses were used for children or the unmarried. Mourners followed on foot or in carriages. It was a mark of great prestige to have large numbers of carriages following the hearse. In the country, the dead might be buried on the family property in a private cemetery or in a country graveyard. In cities, the dead were interred in church crypts or graveyards. Now, the traditional city graveyard in, say, London had quite a reputation as a public health menace. I will not quote any of the many disgusting descriptions of the stench, the exposed skulls and bones, and the swelling lead coffins. Cemetery workers would drill holes and light off the gases of decomposition so these coffins would not explode. As a reaction to these noxious churchyards, in the 1840s, there was a movement to bury the dead away from cities in what were termed garden cemeteries, like Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, seen in the slide. These tranquil landscapes were to be filled with trees and flowers, beautiful vistas, and picnicking families. Cemeteries were advertised as places for a pleasant outing. About the time of the Civil War, the style shifted from austere funerals to a fashionable parade of mortuary extravagance. The Gilded Age was a golden age for the conspicuous consumption of coffins and other funerary goods. Formerly, a coffin might have been made from pine by a cabinet maker or a member of the family, but increasingly it was common to purchase from the undertaker an elegant French polished mahogany casket trimmed with silver fittings. The coffin was now called a casket, as if the dead were precious jewels. Another lavish casket was the Fisk metallic burial case with a glass porthole over the face to view the corpse. The metal was often molded to seem like a cloth shroud. These were very expensive and were often used when a body needed to be transported a long distance because they were designed to be airtight. Some of you may remember the little girl in an iron coffin dug up in San Francisco a couple of years ago. She was perfectly preserved after over 100 years in the grave in her airtight casket. The extravagant funerals of the rich and famous were reported in the papers in great detail, including the floral tributes, which were often photographed. Here we see child-sized floral offerings for a little boy named Warren, and a Gates Ajar arrangement topped with stuffed doves, which could be purchased or rented from the florist. Next is an unusual memorial to a girl named Helen, spelled out in real and artificial flowers. This is quite an unusual piece. We see names written in chenille letters or ribbons among funeral flowers, but this is the only name spelled out in flowers I've ever seen. Funeral flowers, as the 19th century wore on, assumed some strange shapes. Harps, anchors, broken wheels, empty chairs, fraternal emblems, and sad hour clocks decked with stuffed doves displaying the time of death. The flowers might also symbolize the deceased's occupation, such as a fireman's call box or a 5-foot-long chief of police helmet made of carnations. The strangest occupational arrangement I've ever run across was a working derrick made of flowers, ordered by the Structural Iron Workers of America in 1888 for one of their members, representing the derrick that killed him. Those are his last words, spelled out on the base. There was a fascination with the minutiae of mourning. Just as today's wedding websites and magazines of the wedding industrial complex print lists of expensive traditions, so it was with mourning. There were articles in newspapers every few months giving the length of time and proper costume and accessories for each type of loss. This repetition suggests great anxiety on the part of the bereaved to mourn correctly. Mourning was aspirational. There were immense social pressures to follow the practices of the upper classes, even when they led to financial ruin. A pauper's funeral was considered a disgrace. The poor paid small sums into burial clubs. These were more common in England than in the United States. They pawned their household goods. They often went into debt just to afford a decent funeral, which might mean some secondhand mourning clothes and a modest hearse instead of a handcart. I was fascinated to learn that the Dockers Union of London owned a simple black wool dress, shawl, and bonnet, which they loaned out to widows from 1880 to 1914, so the widows could wear mourning to the funeral. Here's a telling anecdote about the bullying of the bereaved to mourn in a socially approved way. One poor young widow bought a cheap black dress and a very simple black straw hat to wear at her husband's funeral. But her neighbors and her relatives bullied her until she went into debt, buying a full crepe mourning outfit with bonnet and veil. Sadly, she explained, they said that if I would not wear a mourning bonnet, it proved we were never married. After the funeral, how did the bereaved remember the dead? Families sometimes framed coffin plates as a memento. These were either sold as steps, we buried one and framed one in the parlor, or they were removed by the undertaker before burial and given to the family as a keepsake. You sometimes see coffin plates in post-mortem photographs propped up or attached to the inside of the coffin lid so they could be easily removed. Families might also dry or dip funeral flowers in wax to preserve them and frame them. Funeral flowers for Presidents Grant and Garfield were preserved and displayed to the public. You can actually still see some of President Grant's waxed funeral flowers at the Wilton, New York cottage where he died. Hair jewelry was another way to remember the dead. Hair, preferably cut before death. Apparently it was more difficult to work with if cut afterwards, might be braided or woven into jewelry. Hair might be also cut very finely and added to paint or glued into weeping willow or feather patterns. Hair wreaths, often using hair saved from many members of the same family, were quite popular. These were usually framed and were sometimes labeled with the names of the deceased, like a hairy family tree. We had one of these in our family, and I always was terrified of it. It reminded me of a giant tarantula. There were many professionals who did memorial hair work, and instruction and pattern books were readily available to help the amateur. This photo shows sample hair work patterns. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between hair work given as a token of affection, because it was also used as a sentimental gift or as a memorial. But generally a date and an age will mean that the piece is actually for mourning. Jet jewelry was also used to memorialize the dead. In fact, many dark materials were used for mourning jewelry. Real jet, which came from Whitby, England, black onyx, and materials like gutta percha, which is a type of latex. There was also a special material called Crape stone, which was onyx or glass treated to look like crepe mourning fabric. This was touted as the perfect jewelry to wear with your crepe mourning garb. Then, of course, the dead were remembered in post-mortem photographs, which may be what most people commonly think of when they think of Victorian mourning customs. Let me warn you that the next photograph will be a post-mortem of a lady in her coffin. Even today, there are photographs who specialized in taking the first and last photograph of a stillborn infant as a comfort to the parents. It is a record of the existence, no matter how brief, of one who was loved and who mattered. The impulse to preserve the likeness of the beloved dead was no different for the Victorians. It was not some ghoulish display or goth meme. It kept the memory of the dear one alive. Sadly, the majority of surviving post-mortem photos are of children who died before they could be photographed in life. While post-mortem photography seems morbid to some of us, an 1882 photographer suggested a healing aspect. He wrote of photographing a little child whose tiny hands clasped a posy of flowers. It only took a moment, he wrote, and there was really nothing awful about it. The mother, poor soul, will have something to look at and cry over now. Now a word about a cherished legend of Victorian mourning practices, the standing post-mortem photo. Somewhere the idea got started that some dead Victorians were photographed in a standing position supported by metal proper-uppers. If you can see the base of a metal stand behind a Victorian photographic subject, it means that the subject is actually dead. I hate to disillusion fans of this theory, but this is physically impossible. The metal stands pictured were simply headrests to keep the head of a subject still for a long photographic exposure. They were lightweight articles, as you can see in the photo, that could not support the dead weight of a corpse. I've read a good bit of Victorian photographic literature. Commercial photographers who shared all the tricks of their trade, including how to make the dead look lifelike or as if blissfully sleeping, never once mention standing poses for the dead or using headrests to support corpses. Let's talk a bit about the quintessential fabric of Victorian mourning, crape. You can see its distinctive texture in the photos. It was said to have originated in 17th century Italy, was imported into France, and was used for mourning at the funerals of royalty and the aristocracy, where it got its stamp of approval as a mourning fabric well before Queen Victoria. The fabric we know as Victorian mourning crape has no relationship to the fashionable fabric we know as crape. There's a modern myth that the spelling crape with an A was only used by the Victorians when they meant mourning fabric, and the spelling crape with an E was only used for fashionable fabrics. I've done an extensive survey of the word usage, and the myth does not hold up. Mourning fabric might be spelled with an A or an E. Sometimes it was spelled with both in the same article. It's the context, not the spelling, that tell us if a fabric is for mourning. Generally, crape was made of raw silk or a mixture of silk and wool. The woven fabric had a pattern impressed in it by metal rollers that made it look speckled, or in some cases like the folds and creases of the brain. It had a hard finish, and if contemporaries are to be believed, it had a strange smell that came from the chemicals used to set the folds. It was expensive due to a virtual monopoly on its manufacture by the English firm of Coutolds, yet the fabric was fragile. It spotted and ran in the rain. There are many contemporary reports of the dye streaking and staining the skin and causing eye problems. Doctors railed against it, claiming that the chemically treated cloth caused lung, skin, and eye diseases, and that its dark color caused depression. The fabric's cost and fragility gave rise to dozens of recipes for freshening faded or water-damaged crape until Coutolde invented a waterproof version. I was asked a very basic question the other day: why crape? And strangely, no one seems to have a definitive answer. Crape has an appropriately dull finish. Mourning clothing was not supposed to have any luster, but there were other mourning fabrics with dull finishes like Henrietta cloth or bombazine. Crape's use for royal or upper-class mourning may explain its popularity in the 19th century. Just as the middle classes adopted mutes and feathermen, they embraced crape. In addition, Coutol's did a superb job of marketing the material, and etiquette books reinforced the necessity for wearing it in deepest mourning. It had name recognition, if you will. If you saw crepe, you immediately knew that it was worn for mourning because it had no other use. The fashionable widow who wanted to mourn correctly had to wear dull black dresses trimmed with crepe for the first year. Still, many satires were written about how delightful it was for widows to shop for mourning gowns and accessories, and there were quite a range of products: caps, gloves, handkerchiefs, fans, mourning jewelry, perhaps black petticoats and corsets, although a debate raged over whether black underthings were ostentatious and hence vulgar. Here's a sampling of opinions. 1890. To wear black corsets and lingerie is overstepping the mark altogether and suggests a luxury of grief that is as far removed from genuine affliction as possible. 1898. No suspicion of a white petticoat should be seen with a mourning dress. 1900. Attention should certainly be paid to the item of petticoats in mourning, for many people spoil an otherwise irreproachable ensemble by forgetting the importance of this. In deep mourning, a black silk or satin or a black and white striped silk is correct, while for half mourning, any tone of violet which does not encroach on pink or blue is possible, as also are gray and white. This raises the subject of half mourning, sometimes called second mourning. Half mourning was a way of easing out of the dark of mourning clothing into, eventually, fashionable colors. If a woman went from wearing widow's weeds to an ordinary wardrobe, it was a shock, both to her alleged sensibilities and those of society. She was supposed to first lighten her mourning, add black gowns with a little embroidery or jet, then perhaps wear something in dark gray, graduating into dove gray, mauve or lavender, or even violet. This painting shows a widow eager to throw off her weeds and get back into fashionable clothing. Eventually, perhaps 2 years after going into deep mourning, a widow would be back to regular clothing. If you were unfortunate enough to have a series of family deaths, though, it might be years before you were able to wear anything but black. Now, what mourner would choose to walk around with her face hidden behind a stifling black veil? Surely this was an unpleasant mourning convention forced upon women? Well, yes and no. Despite complaints from the physicians about the health problems caused by the toxic chemicals used in making crepe, many women said they were grateful to have the veil to shield them from curious eyes. Not only did the veil hide the tear-stained face, it showed the widow's bereaved status at a glance and entitled her to public sympathy and respect, at least on paper. Widows held an ambiguous position in society. While we associate widowhood with old age, many Victorian women were widowed quite young by accident, disease, or war. There was little in the way of a social safety net for the poor widow, and upper and middle class women were not encouraged or trained to work. Remarriage might be a woman's only economic option. So on one hand, there were calls to be kind to the broken-hearted widow. On the other hand, the merry widow and her desire to snag another husband was a cliche of Victorian jokes like this one. A widow had buried 3 husbands and was about to bury the 4th. She was known to be quite well off. Said the undertaker to the widow as he measured the corpse, "It isn't perhaps the right time to mention such matters, but if you was thinking of taking a 5th, "Now, that's what comes of being precipitous," replied the widow. "I've just took the barber what come to shave the corpse." The younger widow was always criticized for flirting or knowing how lovely and interesting she looked in her widow's weeds, as we see in this joke from 1883. Miss Gushington said to a young widow whose late husband left her a large fortune, "That is the 14th mourning costume I have seen you wear in 3 days, and each lovelier and more becoming than the other." The young widow replied, "Oh, my dear, I have 40, but such a bother as they were to have made. At one time, I almost wished that poor dear George hadn't died." How long did you mourn for a loved one? Well, it depended on A, your relationship to the deceased, and B, the year or the etiquette book you consulted. It was never completely set in stone. A usual standard was for a widow to mourn at least a year for her husband. Some authorities said full Crape mourning for the first 6 months and lightened second or half mourning after that. Others recommended 2 years, the first year in heavy black and the second easing into gray or purple dresses, again, half mourning. Some people, like the Empress Maria Fedorovna of Russia, spent several decades of her life in mourning and half mourning for her husband. During the heaviest mourning, it was bad form for a widow to go to the theater or any public amusement. But after the initial period, quiet dinner parties and even balls were allowed. There are a surprising number of surviving mourning ball dresses and tiaras. Of course, these might not necessarily have been meant for married widows. There was also the notion of complementary mourning. If you had a distant relation or a friend to whom you wanted to show sympathy, you might don second or half mourning for a few weeks or months. Women bore most of the burden of mourning. Widowers got off lightly when it came to their mourning wardrobes, although they were supposed to wear a hat band called a weed on their hats. We tend to think of this as a simple, narrow streamer of black fabric, but here's an illustration that gives an inch-by-inch guide to the degrees of mourning. The point was to cover the shiny fabric or light color of the hat. The widower might also wear a mourning band on their sleeve. A widower did not need to abide by any lengthy mourning period, and if he had children, he might be encouraged to remarry at the earliest possible date. The Victorians were terrified both of the body snatchers, also called resurrectionists, and of being buried alive. The only true test of death was decomposition. But people were often buried quickly during epidemics or during the summer months, and the papers were full of horror stories about premature burial during coma or catalepsy. Some nervous people left provisions in their wills to have someone stab them to the heart or cut their throat to ensure that they were actually dead. There were also patents for safety coffins with air tubes and bells and flags, in case someone woke up in the grave. But how often these were actually used, we have no way of knowing. The bells and flags and tubes were designed to be removed after a decent interval. Given the imperfect state of medicine, people probably were buried alive. Many more were snatched as corpses by the resurrection men and sold to medical schools who always needed fresh cadavers for the dissection lab. Body donation was unheard of, and the legal supply of bodies was limited primarily to criminals. The body snatchers would dig down to the head of the coffin, break it open, plant a hook under the chin so as not to damage any vital organs, and winch the corpse out of the grave. The corpse would be stripped. A dead body was not legally property, but its coffin and clothing was. If the grave robbers stole so much as a shroud or a coffin handle, they could be prosecuted for a felony. Several methods were used to discourage body snatchers. A fresh corpse was essential, so bodies were simply held in vaults until they were too decayed to dissect. Heavy weights or cages called mort safes in Britain were placed over graves to discourage the snatchers. Family members stood vigil and guards were hired, although they could be bribed to look the other way. Deadly devices were also invented, like the coffin torpedo, created in 1878 by Ohio artist Phil K. Clover. This was a miniature needle gun that would shoot anyone trying to remove a body from the coffin. And in 1902, an Indiana lawyer named Jesse Hodgkin buried a pipe filled with nitroglycerin along with several dozen concussion caps scattered through the soil of his wife's grave. Any digging would set them off, and with them, the nitro. Hodgkin, who created the device to protect the body of his wife, admitted that the explosion would destroy the corpse. but he said he would rather have that happen than to see her remains being dissected by medical students. We don't know how often these devices were actually deployed, but in 1881 in Gann, Ohio, Knox County, 3 men trying to rob a grave struck a torpedo, which instantly killed one of them and broke the leg of another. Mr. and Mrs. William McKinley were no stranger to mourning. Mrs. McKinley lost her grandmother shortly before her wedding, her grandfather shortly afterwards. 2 weeks before she gave birth to her second child, Ida, Mrs. McKinley's mother, Kate, died. Little Ida, as she was known, only lived for a few months. The cherished elder daughter, Katie, died 2 years after little Ida. Mrs. McKinley's brother, George, was murdered while she was First Lady, and of course, President McKinley was assassinated just a few years later. Mourning for the president was nearly universal and quite prolonged. Multiple funeral services were held for the late president. It began at the Milburn House in Buffalo, where he died. His death mask was taken there, and it was there that he was embalmed. A short funeral service was held there, with Mrs. McKinley listening from the top of the stairs. The body lay in state in Buffalo City Hall, then the casket was taken by train, first to Washington, where it lay in the East Room of the White House, then in the rotunda of the Capitol, where a second funeral service was held. Another train journey returned the president's casket to Canton, where he lay in state in the Stark County Courthouse. Next, relatives paid their respects at the McKinley House on Market Street. A final funeral service was held at the First Methodist Church. Then the president's body was taken to the holding vault at West Lawn Cemetery in Canton, where it lay for the next 6 years as his memorial was being constructed. Attempts to steal President Lincoln's body made authorities wary. Military guards stood watch over the body for those 6 years. Shortly after the body was placed in the vault, one of the guards was attacked and stabbed in a mysterious incident that some believed was in an attempt to blow up the vault. It was thought that Mrs. McKinley would not long survive her husband. She rode in the train car with the president's coffin, which she asked to have opened, but was not able to attend the funerals in Washington or in Canton. She visited the receiving vault daily for 3 years, and she said that she feared to leave the McKinley house because she was waiting for the ghost of her husband to return. The public memorialized the late president with a variety of mementos, ribbons, handkerchiefs, even memorial clocks. Curiously, there were multiple reports of persons either wearing crape badges or draping with crape that had previously been used to mourn President Lincoln and President Garfield. For example, Mrs. Eliza J. Phelps of Leavenworth, Kansas, told a reporter about her mourning draperies. She said, "I was living in Jersey City at the time of Lincoln's death and went to New York to attend the funeral. The city was crowded with people and was everywhere decked in mourning. The crape I have is some that was used in this decoration, and I also have a piece of the catafalque. When Garfield died, I was living in Leavenworth and used the same crape. I will use it for President McKinley, which will make 3 martyred presidents for which it has done service." Mrs. McKinley was at last reunited with her husband in 1907, just a few months before the McKinley Memorial was dedicated. Her last words were reported as, "Why should I longer wait? Let me lie beside him." Her casket was placed in the receiving vault until the memorial was finished. Then Mrs. McKinley, the president, and their 2 little girls were laid to rest in the mausoleum. Victorian mourning did not die with Queen Victoria in 1901. It took the Great War to kill it. The First World War, with its overwhelming mass of casualties, was what put an end to traditional Victorian mourning. There was a grassroots campaign from women's organizations to no longer wear deep mourning due to the expense and the deadening effect it had on morale. It was suggested that an old-fashioned jet brooch or a black armband be worn instead of a crepe veil. This campaign actually paid off. The crepe-edged veil and other old-fashioned forms of deep mourning went out of fashion, eventually worn only by royalty and film stars. Despite its many excesses, Victorian mourning has much to teach us. First, that death is an unescapable part of life. The Victorians embraced the idea of a good death where all were reconciled to the inevitable end, followed by the familiar rituals of Victorian mourning. Second, the Victorians showed us how important it was to have a reliable way to tell that someone has lost a loved one. I've been proposing for years that we bring back some recognizable symbol of mourning, black armbands, a black necklace or ring, or simply wearing black from top to toe. As I wrote in a short story about Crape, mourning allows the most casual passerby to sympathize with your loss. It explains, it excuses, it absolves. In conclusion, mourning Victorians were not just morbid people obsessed with death. They were people like us who cared, who mourned the frequent losses in their lives while trying to accept the inevitability of death, and who comforted themselves with traditional mourning rituals. And like us, they longed to be reunited with those who were not lost, but gone before. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was really, really great
Thank you.
and insightful. Chris is recovering or in the depths of a cold or some kind of virus. So she asked to have a moment to kind of breathe.
I think we're okay. I think we're all right. Yes.
Okay. I did want to mention that
Thank you.
There's a bibliography of notes that Chris provided us with that has links to all sorts of information from blogs to books if you're really interested in the subject that you can delve into, including information on how to get Chris's book. So I just want to start out and ask you, Chris, where's the best way to connect with you if people are interested? Where can they purchase your book and visit your blog?
Well, first, contact your local bookstore or library and ask them to order it. It's also available for Amazon, on Amazon and for Kindle. You can connect with me at the Victorian Book of the Dead on WordPress. That's my blog, and I'm also on Facebook at the Victorian Book.
Okay, we're getting a little bit glitchy here. So if you missed what Chris was saying, she seems to be frozen to me. Now she's coming back. That all of that information I think is in the chat. Chris,
it should be, yes.
we have a few questions here in the Q&A. Someone was interested. We've talked a lot about women's fashion for mourning. What did men do? What sort of rituals did they have?
They had very little to do. It was so easy for a man. I mean, he could go out and get married the day after his wife died if he wanted to. He did not have to have an official mourning period. He would normally wear dark clothes. He would wear a weed, which was a black band of fabric around his hat. And the higher the weed, the nearer the relationship. I think the highest one is actually for a parent, and then it gets smaller and smaller until you're to a cousin or something. It was to cover the shiny fabric of the hat or the light color, because you did not want to be shown wearing anything shiny or light colored in mourning. A black tie was often used, but there was no real requirement. Now, I know in France, some of the dandies wore shirts that were white with black edgings on them, like mourning stationery almost. And they had black enamel dress sets for their cufflinks and vest buttons.
Can you talk a little bit about class differences for mourning?
There was a lot of difference in class mourning. The aristocratic funerals started out as all pomp and circumstance, but then those things were adopted by the middle classes and the lower classes. They adopted the feathermen, the elaborate hearses, the mutes, and the upper classes said, okay, we're not going to play. We're going to label these things vulgar. And they simplified their funerals. Now, if you wanted to go see an example of class differences in funerals, the place to go was France. They had 10 classes of funerals from the first class to the 10th, which was almost the equivalent of a pauper funeral. And there was a manual where the most minute details were spelled out. Very bureaucratic. Hearse horses, the type of pall that was on the coffin, the hearse driver's livery, very, very detailed. I suppose you could, if you wanted to break out of your class, if you had extra money, and hire a first class funeral if you were only entitled normally to a fifth, but people would have thought that was getting above yourself.
There's another question here about your research and the cities that you chose or the information you found. Was it mostly, were you looking at the United States, Europe, the East Coast? Did you find rituals in the Midwest and other places?
Yes, I looked at papers, a lot of newspapers all over the United States and in Britain. There's also quite a lot of information in, for example, magazines, journals and magazines, both in Britain and America, about mourning rituals. As I said, about every few weeks or months, there would be a new article telling you exactly what was correct for mourning. Lots and lots of anxiety about not doing things properly. The etiquette books also had loads and loads of information on how to do this properly, how to be bereaved and what to wear and how not to make a mistake. So I did not cover much of Europe because I was sticking primarily to English speaking sources. And a lot of what has been written has been about the Victorian funeral in Britain. When I wrote the Victorian Book of the Dead, I wanted to get away from the aristocratic funerals and the royal funerals, which were a lot of what some of the history books cover. And what did the man in the street think? What did the man in the street do? So I tried to get a little more of an egalitarian view of how people mourned.
It looks like someone was just as fascinated with, as I was, by the stories of the embalming fluid getting accidentally drunk. They're asking, what do you know anything about what that would actually do if it was ingested? Was it poisonous?
Oh yes, it was formaldehyde or arsenic based, and yeah, I wrote an actual a blog post called "Pickled to Death" about the many people who died from it or were driven out of their minds. There was one lady who actually was institutionalized because she was just too ill to function. But yes, it was very, very poisonous. In one case, the formaldehyde or the embalming fluid was, let's see, it was usually sent in casks, wooden casks, to the undertaker. In this case, the cask was labeled formaldehyde. Somebody filled it with apple cider and sold it. But of course, there was a residue of the formaldehyde still in the wood, and it killed a young man. And there was a lawsuit over that. I've got rather lengthy articles about the lawsuit.
People are asking for the pickled to death link, so I'll see.
That will be in the Victorian Book of the Dead
Okay.
WordPress blog.
Okay, we'll try to get it up on here as we're talking. You provided me with, I'm not an expert on this. Chris just provided me with some cool, interesting facts and questions. So the Saved by the Bell term, did that really come from Victorian mourning?
I wish it did. That would just be such a great story, but it doesn't. The earliest reference I've seen was from about 1902, and it comes from the boxing matches. The bell ends the round, the referee's counting down to 10, and if a boxer is saved by the bell rings to end the round before the referee can finish counting 10.
And so the thought was that it was the bell and a coffin bell.
Yeah, it was the, one of those devices that they had the bell and they had a string that was attached to the hand of the corpse. And so it was assumed that if the person woke up, they could ring the bell.
Was there a punishment for not being in mourning attire long enough or not mourning correctly?
There was definitely social ostracism. Lots and lots of stories. Expensive. For example, there was a husband and wife who agreed that they would not wear mourning for each other because it was old-fashioned or it was too morbid, and they believed, you know, the life eternal was coming, so why should we mourn? Well, she died and he did not wear mourning, and he said, I kind of wish I had, because people were constantly coming up to me and asking me about my wife. They did not realize that she was dead. If I had been wearing mourning, I would have been spared these painful and intrusive questions. But there was a lot of pressure just to mourn. As obviously we've got the stories of the merry widow, and it was considered rather scandalous because there's stories about people going in their mourning clothes to, say, summer resorts and flirting and looking for a new husband very openly. It was considered very, very bad taste.
So the idea that like dressing in mourning clothes might signal that you are single is kind of interesting and
Yes.
fascinating. It's not just that you're mourning, but you're available.
Right. And there's actually a joke about a quote unquote old maid being asked by one of her friends, why are you wearing mourning clothes? Who are you in mourning for? And she says, oh, I'm not. I'm just wearing mourning clothes to signal that I'm available because men find widows fascinating. And there was a lot of this notion that widows were sexy. They were experienced because they'd been married, and yet, you know, they were sort of exciting and mysterious because they had this black clothing on. So there were a lot of widow jokes, and thousands of widow jokes, and thousands of jokes about the merry widow.
Someone is asking in the chat about cemetery tombstones, and obviously they were very fashionable in the Victorian era, certain types. Can you talk a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, there was a move to very, very fancy tombstones. Again, this was a display of your stature. If you had a fancy mausoleum, I read the 19th century and early 20th century journals for stonemasons, and they will give the price of some fancy mausoleums as if they, you know, so you can tell your next customer, you know, Mr. Moneybags bought this mausoleum, maybe you'd like a better one. Some of the shapes we see are those granite balls on a pedestal, polished granite balls. There's a famous one in the Marion Cemetery that is said to move at the Marchant Ball is called. It's the Marchant family grave. And there are tree trunks, which are always interesting. Those are supposedly for the International Order of Woodmen. It's a fraternal organization. You do see fraternal organization type carvings on many graves. I'm trying to think of some of the more common obelisks. The Egyptian style was always popular, and there's a lot of Egyptian mausoleums that was considered very popular. I think we couldn't build pyramids, so we wanted to do the Egyptian style because it sort of represented some sort of eternal style. I'm not sure why exactly, but Egyptian revival was popular in fashion.
There's a really good point in the chat that a lot of these are related to Christian culture and religion. Were there other mourning rituals in the US that became prevalent for other religions? Did some of these spill over to other cultures?
What I see in the newspapers, excuse me, are everything is predominantly, overwhelmingly Christian, because that was the default in this country. When you hear a reference to, say, funerals in Persia or Turkey or China or Japan, it's treated as an exotic curiosity. In fact, there's a great deal of rather nasty writing about Chinese funerals in this country. Obviously, we had a lot of Chinese immigrants, and they worked on the railroads, and they were in San Francisco and on the West Coast primarily. But they always seemed to make fun of the rituals of either having a Chinese funeral in this country or returning a body to China for burial, which was quite a common practice for Chinese immigrants here. So not much spilled over. It was just either Christian or exotic. They treated it as an exotic custom.
Someone had a really interesting question about getting beyond the experience of mourning, like fashion and rituals and things you were wearing, but feelings and emotions related to mourning the dead. Do you feel like in what you studied, some of the same issues of fear, of sadness, those feelings were prevalent in the Victorian era? How have they changed? How has that feeling about death changed?
As I said, the Victorians knew that death was inevitable. Here in our culture, we seem to feel we will live forever, and we want to live forever. We have in this culture, I think, very little patience for sorrow or mourning. It's painful to us to witness other people's grief. I would like to see a little more consideration of the bereaved. It seems as though we're given a very limited time to mourn. I know not many workplaces have bereavement leave, and if they have it, it's for maybe just days or even a few weeks if you're lucky. And after, say, 6 weeks tops, you're expected to be over it. Just get over it. You know, you're doing grief wrong. You're too stuck. And that's just not how we work. I mean, I don't know if there's been any work on it, but the first year, you're not going to be able to function properly. We know that the year actually has some validity to it. But I think the Victorians, although I'm not sure I'd want to be regulated as specifically, I think we need to have more of a specific grief time and say, you know, within a year, we need to cut this person some slack because they're still grieving and they may continue to grieve. It's not a simple grieve, get over it. It can go on a lifetime. And sometimes you just learn to coexist with that grief. And the Victorians knew that. There is a lot of talk about sorrow. There's a lot of talk about in diaries and letters, you know, about how sad people are. Or, you know, my husband's death is approaching and I don't know what we're going to do because we're going to be thrown out of our house. We won't have any money. My brother won't take us in, that sort of thing. There were no pensions for the most part. And things were quite difficult for a lot of people who lost the primary breadwinner of the family. So yes, I think most of the emotions we would normally expect to think about when we think about grief were certainly powerfully expressed in the Victorian era, and perhaps even more so than today, because we don't talk about death. We don't want to talk about death. We're afraid of it. And I think the best thing we can do is not be afraid. It's going to get us in the end.
Well, with that, Chris, I really want to thank you for your talk today. It was really lovely, and encourage everyone to check out those links. We'll paste them in our Facebook chat as well and share them on our email of the recording that we send out to everyone. So thank you, Chris. If you haven't checked out Chris's book on the Victorian Book of the Dead, or if her blog, please check it out. And please check out the National First Ladies Library and join us for a talk as early as tomorrow. So thanks so much, Chris. It was
Thank
lovely.
you.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in today.